basically I look at what's been going on in the last two years in terms of housing policies. So that means basically government. What has the government been doing, and what has it been, shall we say, talking about as well? Since policy is, to a large extent, is what is expressed as well as what is done. There has been a long history in Egypt of direct provision of social housing, sometimes called public housing, sometimes called housing for low-income people, low-cost housing, or Masakin Shabir. Take your pick. So you have to look at that, what's been going on in the last few years in that frame. The question is, have some of the principles of the revolution, democracy, social justice, etc., to what extent has that migrated into the way government and professionals have talked about housing, or even in the way that NGOs and others address housing? It's unfair for a subject like this to take the last 2 years. There's been a lot of chaotic changes and a lot of issues that are of much more immediate importance than housing, security and the lack of police and the economy going downhill. But I think it's important to at least look at what the government has been trying to do. Basically, housing in general is produced mostly by individuals. Corporate housing is a small, tiny minority. Public housing, state housing, is also a small percentage of total production, and has been for a long time. Most housing, as I will say, is produced either in the formal private sector, which is still mostly individuals. Even in the new towns, housing developments are individual plots in which an owner gets a designer and a contractor and builds over time. Of course, in the new towns, you have to build within a certain amount of time and at least get the outside of it plastered and painted so it looks like it's done. You don't have to live in it, and very few are. Anyway, for example, if you take all our figures come from the census because there's very little else. From 1996 to 2006, there was an increase of 4.6 million units, or 56%. At the same time, the number of households only increased by 34%, i.e., Egypt is producing much more housing than it needs. And that does show itself in a rather embarrassing figure, which is vacancies. We don't know how many vacancies there are, unoccupied and vacant housing, but estimates range from 20 to 30% of the housing stock of Greater Cairo. And vacancies are found everywhere, in the new towns especially, but also in informal areas and also in Zamalek. What kind of housing is being produced? Well, it's largely small footprint, multi-story apartment blocks. On average in urban Egypt, there are like 6 to 10 units per building, average height 4 to 5 floors. These are averages. Single room units represent only 4.5% of the urban housing stock. The days when there was a whole family crowd, there are still whole families living in single units, but that's a very small minority. The gross median area of occupied housing was 75 square meters, and the net 70 square meters. In other words, small but reasonable housing sizes. Those less than 40 square meters were only 5.6%. I could go on and on and on. The utilities are quite good. There may not always be water in the pipes, but and the sewers may overflow. But in urban Egypt, a large majority of housing units have both water and sewage and electricity. So, is there a housing crisis? Yes, if you are a family at or below the urban median income, which is about £1,500 a month, all sources, and you have no equity, you will have a hard time finding something to live in. And certainly if you're a bachelor seeking an apartment to get married, and you have to rely on your salary, you're in deep trouble. However, it is not all gloomy, especially because, as we shall see, the largest production of housing in urban Egypt, and certainly almost all affordable housing, the large majority of housing that these kind of people could afford, is in informal areas. This is not just a statement of my own. This is a well-known fact. Unfortunately, the government doesn't want to recognize it. Okay, housing policies up till 2011. In one sense, it's very easy because housing policy in Egypt has been largely a housing program. The state production, either directly or indirectly, of housing for those in need. Those in need has never been really defined, so they have produced quite a lot of housing units, starting from 1952 to 1982, averaging 37,000 units a year. This is all government figures that come from the Ministry of Housing. And over the 82 to 2005 period, that rose to a rhythm of 54,000 units a year, which is quite substantial, although it went up and down. In the 90s was the peak. Different authorities produced these housing, mainly governors, the Housing Cooperative Association Authority, and the housing cooperatives under it, and the Newtown agencies. All public housing, social housing in Egypt, is distributed on a very rudimentary basis. You have to fill out an application, you have to have a valid ID card, and you have to sign a declaration that you do not already, neither you or any one of your immediate family, enjoy a public government subsidized housing unit. That's it. There's no means test. There's no attempt to link need with geographic area other than on the most general scale. And if there's more demand than there is supply in any particular program or any particular city, the distribution is made by lottery. So basically, it's luck. Added to that, the fact that most housing, and increasingly so, is built in the new towns and in areas which are very remote and sometimes don't even have infrastructure. And if you are actually of limited income, you cannot afford to establish a livelihood out there. So even though the subsidies have been large, this massive subsidy, and it's been quite substantial, is sort of a hit or miss. It's sort of, if you're lucky, you get one, and although you're not supposed to sell them, everybody does. If you're really lucky, you get a unit on the ground floor, and you wait around, and then you can get, someone will come and pay you quite a lot of money to turn it into a shop. So this is the sort of how things have been going. Since 2005, there was the new National Housing Program, which called for 500,000 units to be built in 6 years. It's also called Wa'ad al-Rais, and it happened to coincide with Mubarak's presidential term, 2005 to 2011. And this introduced some innovations. The private sector was called in. So you see Haram City in 6th October, built by Rascom. New housing models, especially Ibn Baytak, which some people think is a big disaster. Financial subsidy system was very opaque, and now, and at least under the National Housing Program, it was an upfront subsidy. It started off at 10,000, it was 15,000, now it's 20,000, 25,000. The state pays up front to the developer, so it still supplies that. There was more choice in the amount of down payment you would pay, which would then reduce the installment payment. And they introduced mortgage financing in some of the programs, although most people don't like it. Their heavily subsidized rental units, 36 to 42 square meters, was reintroduced for desperate cases. But that's been used exclusively for resettlement. As of 2010, October 2010, the ministry was very proud to announce that it was on target to meet its 500,000 units. And we have the details in the paper. However, I'm quoting myself, these figures show a certain creative manipulation to present numeric achievements of the program in the best light. You could say this about a lot of government programs, including land reclamation. They actually had a ceiling, and for a married couple, it's now, recently it was £2,500 salary per month. If you had more than that, you didn't qualify. So you had to bring in something that said, I don't earn 2,000. Neither me nor my wife earn £2,500, which 90-some% of Egyptian families do too. So that's the only means criteria. And you had to sign a thing saying you didn't already have a unit, which is very easy to do, and no one's going to check up on you. The most serious problems of that program, and why is that program, which ended in 2011, important? The locations of these units were almost inevitably remote and unattractive to limited income families. Young professionals with private vehicles are moving into them. The infrastructure costs are never calculated well, and that's another just additional subsidy that sort of trickles out of the state budget. I must add that there were other regulations and laws which were put in place over the last few years, and of course one is the new communities law, the new rent law, which is very important, 1996, the mortgage law of 2001, which has remained a feeble attempt, the property tax law of 2008, which is still not applied, and finally the Unified Building Code of 2008, which makes regulations even more strict and more difficult to remain formal in the housing process. Basically, there has been no housing policy, no attempt to stand back and look at the whole scene and say, how could we maybe make the whole system work better? None have tried to make housing more accessible or affordable to the poor or even the average income household. Most legislation has had the effect of making housing more expensive and less accessible to a large segment of the population. There's a dynamic housing market, but no one looks at it. And there have been proposals, specifically in 2008, of ways you could start to make the housing market work better, especially using the rental law system. The conclusion of all that is that none of these proposals have been considered by the government. After the revolution, 2 months after the revolution, Faiza Abu Magad sent a letter around to all the donors saying, oh, we have a new housing program. The last one was 500,000 units in 6 years. This one is going to be 1 million units in 5 years, a level of production that each 4 times anything that has ever been done. And this was going to be a very expensive program, and interestingly enough, they called on the donors to pick up half the tab. It continues. The government still today talks about the National Housing Program of 1 million units. However, as far as I can tell, none have been delivered. And only about maybe adding them all together, the Army is building some, and some have been allocated. Maybe 30,000, 40,000 are under construction. In other words, it's seriously in trouble. But nobody likes to talk about it. Instead, they talk about, yes, there's going to be so many units by governorate, X number of units, et cetera, et cetera. They've talked about many things. There's 100,000 plots of land in new towns for limited income, plots of land, by the way. But those will require you to have at least 300,000 to 400,000 pounds of equity to build. So that's hardly land for those with limited income. There's other schemes to try to get expatriate Egyptians to buy land in a new town, just basically generate revenues. It seems that the pronouncements that are emanating first from the military government and now the Muslim Brotherhood government, it continues the preoccupation with grand urban schemes in the desert. They're not talking much about housing at all, except to say we have a national housing program, so that problem is solved, even though it's so far off track And anyway, if it were actually on track, it would be worse because that would represent another amazing waste of public investment, which they don't have. So basically, there is no affordable housing policy. So how can we generalize on this? Looking from what has been going on in the last 2 years and what the government has talking about, first, populism and the underlying state paternalism is alive and well, and even more so. In other words, the state shall provide, even though it has no money to provide, and that is reflected in the National Housing Program. Secondly, the current Egyptian government, in terms of housing policy, just announcements of what's going on, is more opaque than ever. I like the word murky. Third, the concept of high modernist government continues unabated. From the Mubarak era, most Egyptian architects, engineers, and planners, both in and outside government, seem unable to get out of the idea that Egypt can somehow emulate the West, or more likely the Gulf. And finally, it appears that the current government is continuing the idea that the private sector will somehow provide to build new cities and also new housing. It was quite prominent under the Mubarak era, and even though half of the people are in jail now, it seems to come up again and again in the discourses. To be fair, 2 years is too little to say really what's happening, but these are little hints. Thank you.